Well, tonight I'm going to be trying to answer the question, did Jesus really exist? And what I'm doing, I'm going to try to refute the Jesus myth hypothesis. Now, a lot of Christians, when they hear that I actually give talks defending Jesus' existence, they think, what is this guy, some kind of nut? Everybody knows Jesus exists. But we have to understand what we've done in our government-run public school system. In a lot of areas, our kids are not being taught history. And in postmodern times, you have many educators and philosophers teach our children that there is no objective true history. And so with that kind of historical relativism, it only makes sense that we would have a lot of young people, especially internet atheists, who are now starting to deny Jesus' existence. So for the first time, really, in the history of Western Christianity, we're being asked now not only to defend Jesus' resurrection, not only to defend that he is God the Son become a man, not only to defend his miracles and he fulfilled Old Testament prophecies, but now we're actually being asked to defend that he even existed. By the way, I've often said this too, that if I were an atheist and wanted to attack Christianity, I would force my opponent, the Christian, to defend everything. So I would deny everything. And that's exactly what these guys are doing. They're saying, I don't even believe Jesus existed. So you've got to present some kind of evidence for that. Some really good, it's all in your notes, your handouts. Anything that you see on here should be in your notes. So if I say something that's not there and it's really, really profound, write it down and then tell me after the lecture's over so I can take credit for it. But I did that on accident because everything that's up there should be in your notes. But if you want to read more heavily into this, people like J.P. Moreland, Ronald Nash, Mike Licona, Edwin Yamauchi, Paul Eddy, Gregory Boyd, J. Warner Wallace, he's the cold case detective that applied his skills. I've met J. Warner Wallace in North Carolina, a great guy, but he was a homicide detective, and he used his cold case detective techniques to investigate the Gospels and came to believe that Jesus rose, and he became a Christian because of that. Mary Jo Sharp and Mark Foreman. I believe Mary Jo Sharp wrote for Biola University, she wrote her master's thesis defending the historical existence of Jesus. But with all the evangelicals arguing that Jesus existed, I want to do something different. I want to start my defense of Jesus' existence by turning to kind of Darth Vader, public enemy number one of evangelical Christianity, the world's leading anti-Christian New Testament scholar as far as having an impact on the multitudes is Bart Ehrman. So this is a guy, he teaches at University of North Carolina, the Chapel Hill campus, and he's considered a great teacher and a great mind, and he's an expert on the New Testament, yet he claims that Jesus never claimed to be God. Jesus isn't God. He didn't rise from the dead. So basically what I'm doing is I'm going into the enemy's camp and showing how weak the view is that Jesus never existed. He's famous for his work misquoting Jesus, where he tries to argue that we shouldn't even trust the New Testament manuscripts because there's so many variants, so many mistakes in the different copies. And I've got, a lecture where I give that refutes that. In fact, my Hijacking Historical Jesus, I have a chapter refuting his work and misquoting Jesus, and my co-author, Kyle Larson, has 4 other chapters refuting some of Bart Ehrman's ideas. But that's how he became famous for attacking Christianity. But then he wrote a book a few years ago entitled, Did Jesus Exist? Okay? And the subtitle is The Historical Argument for Jesus of Nazareth. And so he shocked a lot of his anti-Christian fans by writing a book arguing that Jesus actually did exist. Okay? So here you have the leading anti-Christian New Testament scholar. See, a lot of people think, well, if a guy's a New Testament scholar, he's probably a Christian. No, if a guy's a Christian, he's probably going to become a pastor or a theologian. If he becomes a New Testament scholar, probably 9 out of 10 of them don't believe, or at least start out not believing. It's amazing how many, because of the evidence, become believers. But he argues that against inerrancy. He believes the Bible contains errors. It's merely a human book. He argues against the historical reliability of the New Testament text. Still, Bart Ehrman acknowledges that no serious historian or New Testament scholar should deny that Jesus of Nazareth existed in the 1st century A.D. and that he died by crucifixion. So I'm going to public enemy number 1 to show you some of the things he says about that. So in his 2012 book entitled Did Jesus Exist?, Bart Ehrman says the following. At a reputable university, of course, professors cannot teach simply anything. They need to be academically responsible and reflect the views of scholarship. That is probably why there are no mythicists, no people who believe that Jesus is a myth, at least to my knowledge, teaching religious studies at accredited universities or colleges in North America or Europe. He states, their views are not widely seen as academically respectable by members of the academy. Okay, and that's on page 220 of Did Jesus Exist? He argues on page 230 of that book that there is no unambiguous evidence, no clear evidence for pagan dying and rising gods before Christianity, and no evidence that such gods were worshipped in rural Palestine. So what he's basically saying is the Jesus mythers say, look, there's always been stories of dying and rising gods. Christianity is not unique. The early church just borrowed from these pagan stories of dying and rising gods. And by the way, belief in dying and rising gods was very popular in ancient Israel, what some would call Palestine. Okay? Bart Ehrman says no. There's no clear evidence for any pagan dying and rising gods before Christianity. So there was nothing for Christianity to borrow from. And there's no evidence that these supposed hypothetical pagan gods were even worshipped in the area of ancient Israel. Okay? So he's basically saying there's no grounds for evidence for this view that Jesus was just a myth. He argues that even the enemies of Christianity admitted that Jesus was a real historical person. He even acknowledges early oral traditions about Jesus that are quoted in the New Testament, like the Creed, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, which gives a summary list of the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. And he says these things go back to the earliest days of the church. These are not legends that were developed decades later, let alone hundreds of years later. So Bart Ehrman argues that there are too many early sources written immediately after Jesus' life to deny his existence. He even says the sermons in Acts chapters 1 through 12, mostly Peter's sermons, are very early. They go back to the earliest days of the church. So Bart Ehrman sounds pretty conservative when it comes to the existence of Jesus. He says, look, there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that Jesus existed and no good historical evidence to deny that assertion. So that's why anybody who holds to this Jesus myth hypothesis is not going to get himself a professorship in a religion or a history department at any major university in America, North America, or in Europe anytime soon. It's just way too clear that Jesus existed. In fact, when I debated the issue of the resurrection in upstate New York, at State University of New York, in Oswego, it's either Oswego or Oswego, New York. It's right across from Canada, up in New York State, against an atheist out of Arkansas named Doug Kruger. we were debating the resurrection. Well, I believe he was a biology teacher, a biology professor of the school, came up during the Q&A, and he asked me the question, hasn't it been historically proven that the whole idea that Jesus was God and that he rose from the dead, this is something that did not exist until 325 AD, 300 years after Christianity began, during Emperor Constantine at the Council of Nicaea. And I said, no, that's Daniel Brown stuff. That's Da Vinci Code, phony baloney history. There's no credible scholar who would agree with that. I said that the early church proclaimed Jesus as divine from the day the church started, from the early 30s AD. I said Larry Hurtado, University of Edinburgh, one of the world's leading New Testament scholars, affirms that in his work, The Lord Jesus Christ. So then he kind of chuckled like I was an idiot, and then he turned to the atheist and he went like this with his hand, said, I want to hear your response. And the atheist, Doug Kruger, said, yeah, Phil's right. And the guy left baffled. So there might be guys in the biology department that are not well read on history, or the math department that are not well read on history. But if you're teaching history or religious studies department, you're going to be laughed out of that department if you're trying to claim that Jesus didn't exist. Now, I think that will change in the future, because we have a culture that really doesn't cherish truth. And we want to believe what we want to believe. We could care less what is true. And if we don't want Jesus as the Lord in our lives, what better way to get rid of him than to deny his existence? Bart Ehrman argues that even Paul, there's 7 of Paul's letters, by the way, that are almost universally accepted as authentic letters of Paul, written between 49 and 61 AD. You have Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philemon, Philippians, and 1st Thessalonians. And virtually all New Testament scholars accept those as written by Paul. So we're talking even non-believing scholars that don't believe the whole Bible is God's Word. They acknowledge that Paul existed and wrote at least 7 letters. And so Bart Ehrman argues that Paul knew about the historical Jesus, and he met his disciple Peter, and he even met Jesus. He met James, Jesus' half-brother. So when he was on Reggie Finley's show, Internet Infidels, an online radio show, Reggie Finley said, well, what do you tell these idiots that believe Jesus existed? And Bart Ehrman said, well, he did. And Reggie Finley said, you don't mean to tell me that you believe Jesus existed? He said, of course he did. And then Reggie Finley said, well, we have no writings about Jesus while he was still alive. And Bart Ehrman said, well, we don't have the writings about anybody who existed in the 1st century AD while they were still alive. You usually wait till a guy dies before you write about him in ancient times. And so then I just watched a minute or 2 video on YouTube. Bart Ehrman was speaking at an atheist conference, and somebody else asked him that question. What do you do with these idiots that believe Jesus really existed? And Bart Ehrman just got fed up, reached the end of his rope, and said, look, guys, I know this is really popular on the internet, but if you want any credibility whatsoever in the academic community, just drop this idea right now that Jesus didn't exist. And then he said, look, we even know an author named Paul who knew this guy's brother. And he's talking about Paul knowing James, okay? So keep in mind, where we're at right now in academic circles and scholarly circles, you're considered a joke if you deny Jesus' existence, even in non-believing scholarly circles. The problem, well, then you might be thinking, well, then why are you here? Well, I'm here because of young, aggressive atheists on the internet who now the popular thing to do is to deny Jesus' existence. And by the way, in a culture where we've dumbed down our young people, progressively dumbed them down and taught them to disrespect truth and to disrespect history, We have a lot of young people that are going to the internet for their knowledge of history and are wide open to claims like this. Bart Ehrman even points out, even makes the point, says, look, the Jews would have never invented the idea, and the early church was Jewish, the Jews would have never invented an idea of a crucified Messiah. The Messiah is the greatest, the ultimate Jewish king, the greatest Jewish king ever, and they're going to have him die the most shameful death possible, have the pagan Romans in public strip him naked and slaughter him on a tree so that others can see. The Jews would have never invented this concept on their own. The only way to explain it is if Jesus of Nazareth was crucified approximately 30 A.D. So he concludes that there's far too much early reliable evidence for Jesus' life and death by crucifixion. Now keep in mind, Bart Ehrman is not our friend. Bart Ehrman is the leading anti-Christian scholar when it comes to New Testament history. Okay? So now we get on the scene these new group of internet atheists. You get guys like Richard Carrier. Now, Carrier was arguing that Jesus didn't exist long before he got his Ph.D. degree in classical literature at Cambridge. But because he got his Ph.D., let me tell you, you can have the dumbest idea in the world. You get a Ph.D. at Cambridge, probably the second most famous school on the planet Earth, only Oxford is more famous. You get a Ph.D. from Cambridge on the subject, and all of a sudden, if you're telling people the moon is made out of cheese, all of a sudden it gives it the appearance of scholarship and credibility. And so Richard Carrier, there's a lot of young people are falling for the Zeitgeist movie. And they talk about all these similarities between Jesus and pagan gods. And it's like when you read it, the first time I read it, I was intimidated. I was like, wow, how do we explain this? Well, half the time they're making up all the stuff about the pagan gods. And but the Zeitgeist movie has destroyed a lot of people's faith. Christianity becomes a big conspiracy. Just think about it. It's a big conspiracy. It was all about power. And so let's look at all the power that Paul got through this lie. Well, he didn't get much. He got beheaded, okay? What about Peter? Well, he got crucified upside down. What about Andrew? He got crucified on an X-shaped cross. I mean, if these guys are in it for political power, they did a lousy job, okay? They were not the people in power. The people in power, the politically correct, they don't get nailed to crosses, okay? But the Zeitgeist acts like that's what it was, and we're just accepting all these lies. And now in these postmodern days, we need to question all authority, and that includes the authority of the Scriptures. And then Robert Price. I got the dialogue with Robert Price. I wouldn't call it a debate because Reggie Finley went one-on-one with me in his Internet Infidel show and didn't do well. So then he threatened me with a Jesus seminar guy. Then he went out and got Robert Price. And I would have loved to have dialogue with Robert Price, but every time I was trying to respond to what Robert Price was saying, Reggie Finley kept throwing in his own questions. I even had to waste some of my time explaining the difference between the resurrection and the ascension, which occurred 40 days later, because Reggie didn't know. And so someday I'd like to debate. I like Robert Price. I think he's a good guy. I'd love to debate him one-on-one in a time debate where we both have equal time. And brilliant guy, but it's like I said, you realize, Dr. Price, that if we hold to your view, we would throw out, he only accepts views of eyewitnesses who recorded these things when the events actually occurred, okay? And by the way, I believe we have that in the New Testament. If you read my book, Hijacking Historical Jesus, I'm open to the possibility that all 27 New Testament books were written before 70 A.D. But I would hold to probably Revelation, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. You can make a case they might have been written after 70 A.D., but I hold to very early. I believe that Matthew was starting to write his gospel before Jesus was crucified. You realize the first version of Matthew's gospel, according to an apostolic father named Papias, writing about 110 AD, just about one generation after the apostles had died out, and only 20 years after John, the apostle John, had died. But he said that Matthew originally wrote his gospel in Hebrew, and that it was called the Logia of our Lord, the words of our Lord, or the oracles of our Lord. So I think that the first edition of Matthew's gospel was just probably Jesus' sermon notes as recorded by Matthew. I mean, twice in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus calls the apostles scribes. Scribes are scribes because they scribble, not because they memorize. Let me tell you, I'm not God, but if I were God and I became a man, you better believe somebody's taking notes. Okay? And but whatever the case, I told Robert Price, I said, if we accept your views, we wouldn't accept any history from the 1st century AD. We wouldn't even accept the existence of the Caesars and the Roman emperors. And he said, I'm okay with that. So I told him, I said, yeah, but that's the problem. Nobody else is okay with that. And then later on I called him an apostle of denial. He denies what everybody else, even non-believing scholars, disagree with. And he kind of was offended by it. I felt bad because I liked the guy. But whatever the case, these guys are bringing back this idea. So Robert Price, his attack on Jesus, he says the early church borrowed ideas from pagan myths and that Jesus never really existed. Jesus was merely a myth. In response to this, there's several things we need to note. First, this is a revival of the discredited Christ myth theory of the 19th century. So the late 1800s, there were some New Testament scholars who held this view. Now keep in mind, we were just finding some of the older manuscripts at this point. Okay? And so Price wants us to ignore 150 years of progress in critical New Testament studies, which has rejected this idea that Jesus was just a myth and not a real historical person. So it's kind of like anti-Christian New Testament scholars start out denying everything. But then they keep finding, the more study they do, they find more and more evidence for Jesus, to the point where now you can take what the vast majority of New Testament scholars will give you, and you can prove Jesus' resurrection from that. Well, Robert Price is saying, Richard Carey is saying, we don't like where this is going. We want a do-over. We want to go back to the start. And I don't see any good reason for that. And most New Testament scholars, even the late Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan and Gerd Lüdemann, all radical far-left New Testament scholars acknowledge that Jesus existed and he died by crucifixion in the early 30s AD, and they even acknowledge that the early disciples of Jesus believed they saw him alive after his death. But then they go on and say, but that couldn't happen because they have an a priori bias against miracles. So basically the problem really isn't, all the historical data is there to prove Jesus existed. He died on the cross and bodily rose from the dead. All the evidence is there historically. So when people deny all that historical evidence, it's not because of the lack of historical evidence. The historical evidence is there. They actually deny it because they have a philosophical bias against miracles. Let me tell you, miracles are only impossible if God does not exist. And there's an enormous amount of evidence for God's existence. That's a whole other lecture. I've written books on the topic, The God Who Sits Enthroned, Evidence for God's Existence. But if God exists, miracles are possible. God does exist, miracles are possible. What does the historical evidence say? Oh, it says miracles did happen because the historical evidence tells us that God visited this planet, became one of us, performed public miracles, died on the cross for our sins, and then bodily rose from the dead. But Robert Price wants us to deny all this. He assumes without evidence that miracles are impossible. So he automatically denies the incarnation and the resurrection, and so his bias against miracles dictate his views about Jesus. That's like why when I debated Dr. Mark Fulton, a guy out of Australia, on the resurrection, I asked him, I said, it was supposed to be a debate. He's supposed to be arguing that the historical evidence isn't strong enough to conclude that Jesus rose from the dead. And I said, what's your worldview? And he said, well, I'm an atheist. I said, do you believe miracles are possible? He said, of course not. I'm an atheist. And I said, well, what amount of historical evidence would you have to see before you would believe that Jesus rose from the dead? And he said, I just told you I'm an atheist. I'll never believe it, no matter how much evidence there is. And so then I responded, why in the world are you even taking this debate then? You should just debate, are miracles possible or does God exist? But once you acknowledge the existence of God and miracles are possible, you look at the historical evidence, and we got 27 books, not to even mention all the non-Christian writings, not to even mention all the other Christian writings as well. A mountain of evidence for Jesus' life and death and ministry and resurrection. The early church was rooted in Judaism. Gentile pagan influence was minimal, if not non-existent. You realize there's things that they never find in ancient Israel. Like they have a hard time finding ancient coins with an image on it because the Jews were so opposed. So when you go to Jewish communities, you just don't find it. You don't even find skeletons of pigs because it was an unclean food. The Jews, just like they do today, they managed to keep themselves separate from the cultures around them. So the early church was rooted in the Old Testament and Judaism. Gentile influence was minimal, if not non-existent. Robert Price wants us to believe the Jews were willing to embrace any pagan myth that came their way. Well, that wouldn't explain why the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. Why the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 A.D.? Because they got sick and tired of the Jews refusing to say Caesar is Lord. They got sick and tired of the Jews refusing to accept the pagan ideas of the Romans. Okay? And so the early church was not... If the early church was okay with borrowing from pagan belief systems, they wouldn't have been martyred. Okay? You don't martyr the guys that agree with you. You martyr the guys that disagree with you. Okay? Now, Christian philosopher, a good friend of mine, J.P. Moreland, great guy. Pray for him. He's having some real difficult health issues at this point. But he teaches at Biola's Talbot School of Theology, a brilliant philosopher. He also responds not directly to Price, but to the whole Jesus myth hypothesis. In fact, Moreland was responding to it before it was even made a comeback, before it was popular. I think he knew it would make a comeback. But he says of the ancient mystery religions, of dying gods that came back to life, he says, first off, they were never intended to be historical. So any ancient stories of gods coming back to life, nobody believed it was a literal guy who lived and died and came back to life. It was all associated with the yearly vegetation cycle. So they're trying to explain why in the fall and the winter does vegetation die, and then in the spring it comes back to life, and then goes through the summer, but then in the fall it dies again, fall and winter. And so they made up mythological stories about that, and it has nothing to do with Jesus of Nazareth. I mean, if you think the Gospels were not based on history, when you go home tonight, read Luke chapter 3. Okay? Because they'll tell you who the governor was, who the emperor was, what the census was all about. They'll give you an incredibly boring genealogy. So these guys are saying too, they're saying, obviously the New Testament is just mythology. There's no concern about recording real history. That's what they say on Monday. But on Tuesday, what do they tell you? If it's the Word of God, why would it contain all these boring genealogies? We see they're contradicting themselves. The reason why God records all these quote-unquote boring genealogies, God is concerned about history. Okay? By the way, I don't know how many... I don't think there's a whole lot of people that you could trace their whole lines all the way back to Adam. But you could do that with Jesus and his ancestors. And why can you do that with his ancestors like David? Well, because Jesus was coming. So it's all about Jesus there. Moreland also says the similarities with Jesus and the pagan religions, they're apparent, they're not real. Usually what goes on, if you talk about a pagan religion and you talk about rebirth or regeneration or sacrificial death or substitutionary death, yeah, or baptism, that sounds a lot like Christianity. Problem is, the pagans never use those terms. So if you talk about a pagan religion and you use nothing but Christian terminology, yeah, it makes it sound like there's parallels. Problem is, the pagans never use those terms because the parallels are not real. And the pagan religions were polytheistic. They believed in many gods. Jews only believed in one God. Early church only believed in one God. They were syncretistic. They liked to borrow. The pagan religions liked to borrow, whereas the Jews were very exclusive. They refused to say Caesar is Lord. They said Yahweh is Lord. The early church refused to say Caesar is Lord. They said Jesus is Lord. Okay? And there's a non-moral context in the pagan religions, whereas Christianity has a total moral context. In fact, Moreland argues we have no evidence of a real full-blown resurrection of a dying God before 100 AD. So in other words, any real parallels between Christianity and pagan religions, that's after Christianity is rising in the Roman Empire. So if anybody borrowed from anybody else, it was the pagan religions borrowing from Christianity. It wasn't the other way around. The first century Palestinian Jews rejected pagan beliefs and practices. Probably the world's greatest New Testament scholar of his day, Martin Hengel out of Germany, argued that the first century Jews, they just rejected pagan beliefs and practices. That's what defined them as Jews, was their Jewish faith. And you have the existence of synagogues throughout first century Israel showed that the ancient Jews could read. You see, Richard Carrier, even Bart Ehrman, it's really weird on this one, but and Robert Price, they want the early church to be a bunch of illiterate Jews. In fact, Bart Ehrman will even go to the book of Acts, where the enemies of the church say that, how could these men teach such doctrines when they're unlearned men, uneducated men? Well, number one, I hope you don't go to my worst enemies to figure out who Phil Fernandes is. That's number one. Number two, Bart Ehrman acts like the New Testament, we shouldn't have really any faith in it because so many of the passages are not historically reliable. How does he know that one's reliable? Whenever he sees a verse that he likes, automatically it gains credibility. But in reality, all the Jewish religious leaders were saying, how could they teach such doctrines? They were not trained in our accredited rabbinical schools. They weren't trained in the school of Hillel or the school of Shammai. And then it says, the very next verse, then they remembered having seen them with the unorthodox rabbi, that Jesus of Nazareth. And but they were not saying these are illiterate guys. In fact, if the Jews of Jesus' day were illiterate, why would you need a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament to be translated 200 years before Jesus walked the earth, the Greek Septuagint? You wouldn't need a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament unless most Jews could at least read Greek. The problem was many of them could no longer read Hebrew, okay? But they could still read Greek. They were not illiterate. So Price and Carrier want the ancient Christians to be illiterate, so they hear stories. They're so naive, they just accept everything they hear. And that's not the case. Moreland argues Jesus was a recent historical person. We have excellent historical evidence for his life and works. And an example of that is 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. Let me just read that passage to you. 1 Corinthians 15. Remember, this is one of the accepted books of Paul, and it was written about 55 A.D. Even liberal scholars like Bart Ehrman will give you that. Now, what Robert Price is doing, he realizes if he gives you the 7 books of Paul, and Price used to do that. He used to give you the 7 books of Paul as authentic, 7 out of the 13, but that's enough to prove Jesus. So now, guess what Robert Price is doing now? He's writing books arguing that Paul never existed. You know, I want to know the names of these brilliant forgers, because if it's not Paul, these guys are brilliant. Same with the teachings of Jesus. If Jesus didn't say that stuff, whoever said that stuff, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. He who has seen me has seen the Father. Whoever said that stuff is God. I want to find out who said that. Well, guess what? Jesus did say it. And not some forger who thought, oh, this is going to be funny, you know. And but here's the ancient creed. Paul says, for I delivered to you first of all that which I also received. And then he starts quoting the creed. And it's a creed that reads very choppy in the Greek. You translate it into Hebrew, and it reads like a poem. So it was an ancient creed or hymn recited or sung in the early church before most of the New Testament was even written. It goes back to the earliest days of Christianity. Gerd Ludemann and Marcus Borg of the Jesus Seminar, who deny the resurrection, believe Paul received this creed when he got baptized in Damascus just within 1 year of Jesus' death. So they say that this creed was compiled within the first year of Christianity. And they're skeptics. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, that's the Aramaic name for Peter, then by the 12, and that he was seen by over 500 brethren at once. And then Paul adds to the creed, of whom the greater part remain to the present. So Paul's staking his apostolic authority on the assertion that most of these eyewitnesses are still alive. But some have fallen asleep. Some of them have died. Then he gets back to the creed. After that, he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. And then Paul adds to the creed his own eyewitness account. And then last of all, he was seen by me also, as by one born out of due time. What does Paul mean by one born out of due time? Well, all the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus to the other apostles and to other witnesses were all before Jesus ascended to heaven. But his appearances to Paul were after the ascension. So Paul's saying, I'm like the baby who was born in the 11th month instead of the 9th month. But here we have Paul's eyewitness testimony. He had seen the risen Christ, as well as an ancient creed containing other eyewitness information. So Moreland says Jesus was a recent historical person, and there's excellent historical evidence for his life and works. And the only reason to deny that Jesus actually existed would be if you're just biased against Christianity and you could care less about the historical evidence. Gregory Boyd and Paul Eddy wrote an excellent work called The Jesus Legend. And it's about 400 pages long, and it just refutes this. And Gregory Boyd has debated Robert Price on numerous occasions. They state that the dying and rising gods, when you look at them, Adonis, there's no death or resurrection attributed to Adonis until after Christianity is on the rise. Attis, you have a death but no rebirth, and he's not even a deity. Osiris, this is pretty interesting. You do have ancient accounts that he was murdered and dismembered, I think chopped up into 14 pieces, and then reassembled, though they were missing one piece. I'm not going to mention what piece that was reassembled, but he doesn't really, it's not a real resurrection. He becomes a powerful god in the underworld. So Mike Lacona says this was a zombification, not a resurrection. Jesus came back to life in this world, and not just with his mortal body, but his mortal body put on immortality. Tammuz fails as a candidate of a dying and rising god. A recent find of a Sumerian text shows no resurrection or rebirth of Tammuz. In other words, Tammuz does rise, does have this resurrection, but that's only after Christianity is popular. You go back to the pre-Christian accounts of Tammuz, and there's no resurrection. Boyd and Eddy also argue that Baal, Isis, and Dionysius also fail as dying and rising gods. Now, what Robert Price does at this point, he realizes that almost nobody accepts his views except for young, aggressive internet atheists. And so he says, I need a plan B. My argument's kind of weak. What if nobody accepts my hypothesis that Jesus never existed? He says, okay, well then I'm going to argue, plan B, Jesus did exist, but he was just a normal guy, never performed miracles. But shortly after his death, just within a few years, they began to make legends about him. And so he tries to go to evidence of legend creating movements of the past. And say, well, look at Apollonius of Tyana. The guy dies about 96 to 98 A.D., but just a generation later, and they're attributing miracles to him that sound a lot like Jesus' miracles. Okay? In fact, there's one quote that there was a man living in first century Palestine that would give sight to the blind, and the deaf would hear, and the dead would rise. And he went about for 3 years in this ministry, performing these miracles, and his name was Apollonius of Tyana. And a book starts out like that. And that could be devastating to your faith the first time I heard it. So when I debated Doug Kruger, he starts giving that quote. It's supposed to be questioning me. He starts reading the quote, and I thought, I don't want that to have this impact on the crowd. And so what I did was I just figured, I figured up a little dirty pool there, and I said, oh, come on now, you're not going to read that dumb quote about Apollonius of Tyana, are you? And he got real red and embarrassed and said, okay, I guess I won't. And he moved on to something else and all, but the fact of the matter is it's all baloney. The whole quote is baloney. And the author who originally wrote that in the early 20th century knew it was baloney. Apollonius of Tyana is not historically accurate. You have no resurrection appearances. Let me tell you what happened. The Empress Damis, she hired, I believe, a guy named Philostratus to rehabilitate this phony baloney con artist, Apollonius of Tyana, rehabilitate his reputation, probably to have something to compete with Christianity, because by the early 2nd century AD, it's growing so quickly. So she pays this guy to write it, and it's not historically accurate. They've got Apollonius in Nineveh and Babylon during the 1st century AD when they were uninhabited. And they've got him there, and as if the places are well populated and all. And so all it is actually stealing from Jesus. So it's not a real, and there was no major cult founded on him either. So that fails. Well, so then he says, well, what about Sabbatai Savi? This was a guy who was just a miserable failed Messiah. I just felt sorry for the dude. But he was a guy who claimed to be the Jewish Messiah. Then he got threatened by the Muslims, so he converted to Islam. Then he tried to get the other Jews to convert to Islam. They rejected his message. Then he went off and died. Some scholars believe the guy was mentally ill. There's no reports about seeing him after his death. Now, doesn't that sound like the gospel story of Jesus? No. It's like Robert Price. Are you smoking something when you do your research? This doesn't sound anything like Jesus. I mean, if it sounded a lot like Jesus, if his story was similar to Jesus' story, you'd know who Sabbatai Zevi was before I even brought him up. I didn't even know who he was till Robert Price brought him up. If Sabbatai Zevi was resurrected, he was only resurrected as a literary device by Robert Price. And then he says, well, what about Simon Kimbangu? He was a Congo miracle worker, and he died in prison in 1951. The communists imprisoned him. Go to find out, doing some research on him, the guy never claimed to be God. He just claimed to be a Christian. He tried to lead people to Jesus. Most of his followers are Christians today. But a few of his radical followers who came out of polytheism, belief in many gods, after his death turned him into a god. Okay? So let me tell you what I think about Simon Kimbangu. At worst, he was a Benny Hinn type. A charlatan performing false miracles, calling himself a Christian. But at best, let me say this. Maybe it doesn't fit well with my theology. I don't know what theological background you come from. But these guys got like millions of followers who are Bible-believing Christians right now. And the communists imprisoned him and put to death. Already I'm starting to like the guy. Okay? I'm open to the possibility. If God decides, I want to send a prophet to an African country to proclaim Jesus to them and to heal their sick, you know what? That might weird me out, but I'm okay with that. So I'll find out when I get to heaven and see if Simon Kimbangu is there. But when everything's said and done, even if he's a Benny Hinn type, that doesn't explain what we get about Jesus of Nazareth. Okay? You've got an early church sincere enough about their beliefs, cared enough about history to record these things, and sincere enough about their beliefs to die horrible deaths, to suffer and die for those beliefs. Mark Foreman, a Christian philosophy professor at Liberty University, brilliant guy. He's saying the same thing, so I'm going to just run through this real quick. It's nothing but a revival of an old discredited idea. It was the late 19th century, so late 1800s, the History of Religion School was what it was called. It had a really nice sounding German name to it that made it sound scholarly, but it really wasn't scholarly. One of the first things Foreman says is, look, there's similarities in all religions. Because every religion is going to say, look, there's a problem, and here's the solution. And it usually involves the hereafter. Okay? So right off the bat, just any two religions you look at are going to have, so right at the start, you're going to have some similarities. Okay? He says it's a fallacy to say that temporal priority means the earlier caused the latter. So in other words, even if you could prove there were dying and rising God stories before Jesus, it wouldn't mean that these automatically caused that. Okay? You would still have to say, well, we need to look at the historical evidence for Jesus just to see if he wasn't one of these myths. Maybe he was really a historical character. But it's a fallacy just to say, well, if it came before it, it must have caused it. Okay? He also says the entire theory assumes that Jesus did not really exist in history, and this goes against the bulk of contemporary scholarship, even non-believing scholarship. In other words, Robert Price and Richard Carrier properly understood they're not disproving Jesus' existence. They start out with the premise Jesus never existed before they begin their research. Okay? And so we say, well, Paul talked about it. The Gospels talked about him. Well, they were written much later by people who really didn't know him. And by the way, I argue that Matthew and John were eyewitnesses, and that Luke and Mark got their information from eyewitnesses. But they're just going to throw it out. We don't like it, so we throw it out. Now, what about Paul's writings? Well, we don't even believe Paul existed, so we're going to throw it out. What about the rest of the New Testament writings? Well, we just reject those. We throw them out. Well, what about the apostolic fathers, the early church fathers? They were biased. They were Christians, so they were just lying. We throw that out. What about the non-Christians who wrote about Jesus' life? Well, we throw that out because they got their information from Christians, and we know they must have been lying. You know, that's why Norman Geisler says about stuff like this. That's like a lawyer saying, apart from your 500 witnesses, you don't even have a case. Apart from all the evidence you have, you don't even have a case. Yeah, apart from the evidence for Jesus, apart from all the evidence for Jesus, there is no evidence for Jesus. But there really is all this evidence for Jesus. Therefore, there is evidence for the historical Jesus. And so they don't disprove Jesus' existence. They assume he didn't exist and then go from there. And they like to arbitrarily combine all the religions into one universal model of a dying and rising God, when in reality there is no such model. You just get the historical accounts in the Gospels. They're acting like all these different pagan myths are following the same model, and they're not. Then the mythicists use Christian terminology to describe pagan beliefs, and then this creates a superficial resemblance, and that resemblance really isn't there. Then they make claims about Jesus not found in the Bible. Do you know that December 25th is the birthday of Jesus? The pagans were worshiping, had a special day set aside for December 25th. However, you're talking hundreds of years after Christianity has been established, and now Emperor Constantine becomes a Christian, and he says, I don't want to take away the people's pagan feast, but I would love for them to become Christians. So let me start. So in other words, when Christianity did start borrowing from paganism, that was hundreds of years later. What we're debating is the origin of Christianity. And that's where no borrowing occurred. And then the idea of three kings from pagan literature and stuff like that. Well, guess what? Matthew doesn't even tell us there were three kings. He says they were magi, wise men from the east, and he never tells us there were three. They gave gold, frankincense, and myrrh. For all we know, there could have been 50 of them. So any time where they really start making a case of real borrowing, it's 300 years too late for them to make their case. And then when they get a real parallel, it's because they've misinterpreted the biblical data. There are no three kings. I mean, there's a song, We Three Kings, but I was misinterpreting the scriptures. There's no evidence, Foreman argues, for pagan influence in first century Judaism. No evidence of dying and rising gods before Christianity. It was only after Christianity became popular and was growing and the pagan religions wanted to compete with Christianity. That's when the pagan religions may have borrowed from Christianity as Christianity began to grow. By the way, the sources for this whole, when you buy their books and you see all their footnotes and you check the sources, their sources are not scholars in history, religion, or Egyptology. Okay? So you ought to be able to find some scholars, if not the majority of scholars, in these fields if you're going to build a case. Okay? And then Foreman says they overemphasize similarities while ignoring the differences. And he gives an example of this faulty logic. Did you know that, John F. Kennedy, there's similarities between John F. Kennedy's assassination and Abraham Lincoln's assassination. Kennedy and Lincoln were both elected in the year ending with 60. Lincoln 1860, Kennedy 1960. They both died by a bullet wound to the head, a mortal head wound. Okay? Many people believe in both cases there was a lone assassin. Their vice president's name, who then became the president, was Johnson. Okay? There was even a story that Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy, and Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. It appears that that wasn't true, but that was part of the story. But you could come out with like 10 to 15 parallels between the Kennedy assassination and the Lincoln assassination. So based on this kind of reasoning, you could say, well, the Kennedy assassination was a myth based on the Lincoln myth. And you're doing that based on some real parallels. Some terms are changed, some fiction. But you can make a case the Kennedy assassination was a myth based on the Lincoln myth. Well, guess what? Even with some real parallels, Kennedy really was assassinated in 1963, and Abe Lincoln really was assassinated in 1865. They're real historical figures, and they're real historical assassinations. But Foreman's just saying, look, if I play the game with the rules these guys are playing it, I can turn Kennedy and Lincoln into myths. Okay? So when everything's said and done, the historical, and we don't have time to get into this, but the historical evidence for Jesus is overwhelming. Even if you're not a Bible-believing Christian, I believe the entire Bible is the Word of God, Old and New Testament, okay, without error. But even if you just said, well, I'm going to just suspend judgment on the Bible and just look at the historical evidence, we have evidence of ancient creeds and hymns that go right back to the early 30s A.D., to within a few months of Jesus' crucifixion. And you have ancient creeds and sermons proclaiming Jesus to be God incarnate and risen from the dead and a real historical character. You've got Paul's letters between 49 and 67 A.D. Even if you just take the 7 letters accepted by the most liberal of New Testament scholars, you can build a powerful case for Jesus' resurrection. You got the 4 Gospels. Most Bible-believing Christian pastors would say the 4 Gospels were written between 60 and 95 A.D., but even the Radical Jesus Seminar would say all 4 Gospels were written between 68 and 110 A.D., because some of them will date John's Gospel a little late. I argue in Hijacking the Historical Jesus, you can date all 4 Gospels between 35 and 55 A.D., okay? And if you want to see my case for it, just pick up the book. It's free. And then the rest of the New Testament. So you got all this 1st century A.D. evidence for the historicity of Jesus. And then you compare the manuscripts of the New Testament, over 26,000 copies. Second place, ancient literature, Homer's Iliad, less than 800 copies. Over 99.5% agreement between these copies. Second place, Homer's Iliad of all ancient literature, 95% agreement. That means only 5 words out of every 1,000 in the New Testament are called into question. Homer's Iliad, it's 50 out of every 1,000. New Testament is 10 times more reliable than second best. By the way, when you have 26,000 copies, you can figure out which guy's got it wrong. So when everything's said and done, 26,000 copies with 99.5% agreement equals 100% accuracy. The only debate left for evangelical Bible-believing Christians is which translation is using the best copies. Is it the New American Standard, which removes a few passages because it's based on the oldest manuscripts available, or is it the New King James Version, which includes those extra passages because it's based on the majority of the manuscripts? Okay? Most pastors and most theologians today favored the older manuscripts and the New American Standard, the NIV, and translating like that. I myself, I still like the majority text. I still think the majority text is the proven text for the New Testament. But then we go to the pupils. Oh, and then by the way, so the accuracy, and then the smallest gap. We have such a small gap. Do you realize it's possible we may have fragments of copies of Mark's Gospel and 1 Timothy in Cave 7 of the Dead Sea Scrolls? The only reason why nobody likes to look at it, now a Spanish scholar named O'Callaghan, don't ask me how that happened. A Spanish scholar named O'Callaghan believed he identified a portion of Mark's Gospel, chapter 6, and a portion of 1 Timothy, chapter 3, as well as other fragments. The problem is, if they were in the Dead Sea Scrolls, by the way, it's the only cave containing Greek literature. Everything else is Hebrew. And but you can't date it later than 68 A.D. because the Romans were en route to Jerusalem to destroy it. So if we have copies of the Gospels as early as, 55 to 68 A.D., then the originals, you got to push them back even further. But the Apostolic Fathers, the pupils of the apostles, selected by the apostles to lead the early church, their writings go back to the 60s to 107 AD. When Frank Turek was interviewing me on his radio program, I was referring to Clement of Rome, and he said, well, for our listeners, you may not know, but Clement of Rome was elected to be the Bishop of Rome in 95 AD, and that's when he wrote this letter to the Corinthians. And I said, well, Frank's a good friend of mine. I said, Frank, so I wasn't trying to be mean to him, and he's a fellow New Jersey guy too, but I said, well, Frank, yeah, you're right. Clement of Rome became the Bishop of Rome in 95 AD, but he wrote it in the early 70 AD at the latest, because in his letter to the Corinthians, he says the temple is still standing. So there's an awful lot of stuff. You got to understand, if liberal critics want to date the Gospels and the New Testament later, they're going to have to also push back the Apostolic Fathers. But some of the Apostolic, I think the Didache may have been written in the 60s AD, Clement of Rome, early 70 AD, Shepherd of Hermas could have been written before 70 AD. Epistle of Barnabas, mid-70s AD, is when Lightfoot and Harmer, the premier scholars, they dated to the mid-70s AD, not the 135 AD that liberal critics like to claim. Problem is, if you date these Apostolic Fathers, if you accept the earlier dating, which I argue for in my Hijacking Historical Jesus, they're quoting from the New Testament. So your late dates go out the window. Then we got archaeological evidence confirming much of the New Testament. I mean, there's like between 80 and 100 different archaeologically verified facts, historical facts, from the book of Acts alone. I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Frank Turek and Norman Geisler. An excellent book if you want to look at all the archaeological evidence there. And then the case for Jesus' resurrection and deity. I mean, my old professor Gary Habermas used to debate who at the time was the world's leading atheist. Later on, he embraced God's existence and then he died. Hopefully he came to Christ on his deathbed, but there's no evidence that he did. But Anthony Flew lost 3 debates. World's leading atheist lost 3 debates on Jesus' bodily resurrection with Gary Habermas from Liberty University. And then he lost a debate on God's existence with William Lane Craig, and after that debate changed his mind about God. But there's overwhelming evidence for Jesus' resurrection and deity. Let me say this. If God exists, then miracles are possible. If miracles are possible, you have way more evidence than you need to prove the historicity of Jesus and his resurrection and deity. So really what's on trial here is not really the lack of historical evidence. We have an abundance of historical evidence. It comes down to, are you willing to acknowledge the existence of God? And if God exists, by definition, if he could create the whole universe, he can intervene and perform miracles whenever he wants. You even have secular, non-Christian authors like Josephus, a Jewish historian, died 97 AD, and thousands
right, thank you a bunch, Dr. Stanton.
All right.
Thank you.